The morning sun bathed the park in a golden hue as Aisha strolled along the path, her shepherd dog, Shadow, trotting faithfully by her side. At 72 she found peace in these walks, away from the chaos of the world, just her and the loyal companion she had rescued years ago. Shadow was no ordinary dog, but few knew his past. She had found him at a shelter, a retired police dog with a quiet strength about him. His keen eyes held stories of battles fought and justice served, yet he had been discarded when he was no longer deemed useful. Aisha saw beyond that. She saw loyalty, intelligence, and a heart that still longed for purpose. As they walked, laughter and voices echoed from a bench up ahead. 3 men lounged there, their eyes narrowing as Aisha approached. She had seen their kind before, men who carried hatred like a second skin, who viewed her mere existence as an offense. She kept her gaze forward, unwilling to let them disturb her morning peace. But hatred never needed a reason. "Where do you think you're going, old woman?" one of them sneered, stepping into her path. Another snickered, nudging his friend. "Ain't it funny? These people always think they belong everywhere." Aisha tightened her grip on Shadow's leash. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm. The third man, taller and broader than the others, crossed his arms. "We don't want your kind here," he said. "Turn around." She exhaled, her fingers brushing against Shadow's fur, a silent reassurance. "I have as much right to be here as anyone," she replied. The first man scoffed. Big words for someone so frail. He reached out, perhaps to shove her, perhaps to grab her, but he never got the chance. In an instant Shadow moved. The lazy, easygoing shepherd disappeared, replaced by the disciplined force of a trained protector. With a low, menacing growl, he leaped forward, knocking the man off his feet before he could react. The second man reached into his jacket, but Shadow was faster, his fangs bared as he lunged, pinning him to the ground. The third, the largest of them, raised his hands in surrender, backing away with wide eyes. "What the hell?" he stammered. Shadow did not bark. He did not need to. His mere presence, his sheer power, was enough to drain the blood from their faces. "You picked the wrong woman today," Aisha said, her voice steady as she called Shadow back. The dog obeyed instantly, standing beside her like a silent sentinel. The men scrambled to their feet, fear replacing arrogance, and fled without another word. Aisha watched them go, shaking her head. Hatred was a disease, but today, it had learned a lesson. She knelt beside Shadow, scratching behind his ear. "Good boy," she whispered. Shadow only wagged his tail, his job done. Together they continued their walk, leaving behind nothing but the ghosts of cowardice. As Aisha and Shadow resumed their walk, she felt the lingering weight of the encounter pressing against her chest. She had faced hatred many times in her life, but today was different. Today she hadn't just endured it, she had defied it. And not alone. Shadow padded beside her, his ears still perked, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. He had sensed the danger before it even unfolded. It made her wonder just how many times he had stood against threats in his past life as a police dog. Had he protected officers who might have turned a blind eye to people like her? Had he been loyal to those who would never have stood up for her the way he just did? She sighed, shaking the thoughts away. Shadow wasn't defined by his past any more than she was. He had chosen her and she had chosen him. That was all that mattered now. As they approached a clearing, a familiar figure stood near a park bench, Officer Grant. He was one of the few police officers Aisha respected, a man who had often checked in on her since she moved to the neighborhood. He looked up from his coffee, his brows furrowing as he took in her expression. "Everything okay, Ms. Aisha?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. She hesitated, then sighed. "Had a little trouble with some boys who don't know any better." Grant straightened, his sharp gaze scanning the park. "Who?" "They ran off before they could get what they wanted," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Shadow made sure of that. The officer glanced down at the dog, then back at her. "You mean that Shadow?" His eyes widened in recognition. "Wait, this is the same K9 we had in the force years ago?" Aisha nodded. "He was at a shelter when I found him. Didn't think a warrior like him deserved to be abandoned." Grant let out a low whistle. "I worked a case with this dog once. Best tracker we had. Didn't think he was still around." He crouched down, rubbing Shadow's head. "You still got it in you, old man?" Shadow wagged his tail, but his eyes remained focused as if still on duty. Grant straightened, his face serious. "Tell me about the men who harassed you. I'll put a report in." Aisha shook her head. "They're cowards. If I push this, they'll just lie and say I provoked them." "But they'll come back," Grant countered. "Men like that always do." She met his gaze, a quiet strength in her eyes. Then they'll learn again why I'm not an easy target. Grant exhaled, nodding. You let me know if you see them again. Aisha smiled. I will. As Grant walked away, she turned back to Shadow. He looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with something close to understanding. Guess we make a good team, huh? She mused. Shadow simply leaned against her, the warmth of his presence a silent promise. They continued down the path, the morning peaceful once more. But if the cowards ever returned, they wouldn't just be facing an old woman. They'd be facing a warrior and his partner. Days passed, and Aisha found herself returning to the park as usual, Shadow by her side. Life had a way of moving forward, and she refused to let one ugly incident take away the peace she found in her daily walks. But peace is a fragile thing. One afternoon, as she rounded a familiar trail, Shadow tensed beside her. His ears perked, his muscles stiffened, and his eyes locked onto something ahead. Aisha followed his gaze, and there they were. The same three men. This time they weren't lounging on a bench. They stood together near a tree, whispering among themselves. When they saw her, their conversation stopped. One of them, the broad-shouldered one who had backed away last time, narrowed his eyes. Look who it is, he muttered. Aisha felt Shadow press against her leg. He wasn't growling, not yet, but he was watching them, waiting. The second man, the one who had tried to grab her before, took a step forward. You got lucky last time, old lady. We weren't expecting that, he said, nodding toward Shadow. But we came prepared today. Aisha's fingers tightened around the leash. Prepared? Then she saw it. One of them was holding a thick wooden baton, the kind security guards used. The other had something tucked in his pocket, the shape of it barely visible beneath his hoodie. A knife, maybe. Aisha's heart pounded, but she didn't step back. Fear was a luxury she had never been allowed in life. You don't want to do this, she said calmly. Walk away. The third man chuckled. No, you walk away. Matter of fact, stop coming here at all. The second man raised his baton. Or next time we won't just scare you. Aisha exhaled slowly. Shadow. That was all she said. The transformation was instant. Shadow didn't lunge, not yet. But he shifted his stance, placing himself between Aisha and the men. His lips curled just slightly, exposing teeth that had once brought criminals to their knees. A deep, rumbling growl escaped his throat, a sound that sent a chill through the air. The broad-shouldered man took a step back. The other two hesitated, their bravado wavering. He's just a dog, the one with the baton muttered. Aisha tilted her head. You sure about that? Then, before they could react, she gave a single sharp command. Fast. It was German. A police command. And Shadow obeyed. In the blink of an eye, he launched forward, his powerful body striking the man with the baton. The wood clattered to the ground as Shadow's teeth clamped onto the man's forearm, his growl turning into a snarl. The man screamed, trying to shake him off, but Shadow held firm. The second man panicked, reaching into his pocket, probably for the weapon Aisha had suspected. But before he could pull it out, Shadow released his first target and spun, knocking the second man onto the ground with a forceful leap. His paws pinned the man's chest, his fangs inches from the man's face. The broad-shouldered one? He was already running. Aisha stood her ground, watching as the two remaining men struggled beneath Shadow's relentless grip. Their arrogance had vanished, replaced by sheer, undeniable fear. Call him off, the man on the ground begged. Aisha took her time. You came prepared, she said. You wanted to teach me a lesson. Consider yourselves taught. She whistled sharply, and just like that, Shadow backed off. He returned to Aisha's side, though his eyes never left the two men who scrambled to their feet. They didn't say a word. They didn't even look at her. They just ran. Aisha sighed, patting Shadow's head. Good boy, she murmured. As she turned to leave, she noticed Officer Grant standing at a distance, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. You know, he said, approaching her, most people call me when they have trouble. Aisha chuckled. Didn't need to. Grant glanced at the direction the men had fled. They won't be back. No, Aisha agreed. They won't. Grant shook his head, smiling. You ever think about training other dogs? Or maybe working with us again? Shadow clearly hasn't forgotten a thing. Aisha looked down at the shepherd beside her. He was more than a protector. He was her family. She smiled. No, officer. Shadow and I? We've already got a job. And what's that? Reminding the world that some fights, she said, walking past him, are worth standing for. As they left the park, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows behind them. But Aisha knew, so long as she and Shadow walked together, neither of them would ever stand in the dark. The following week, the park felt different. The air was lighter, the tension gone. Word must have spread about what had happened, how 3 grown men had been humbled by an elderly woman and her dog. Aisha noticed the small changes. People nodded at her more, some even smiled. The regulars, joggers, parents with strollers, elderly couples, seemed relieved as if an unspoken fear had been lifted. She and Shadow had won a battle, but Aisha knew the war never truly ended. Still, life went on. One morning, as she sipped tea on her front porch, Shadow resting at her feet, a knock on the door interrupted the quiet. She wasn't expecting visitors. Shadow perked up but didn't growl, which meant whoever was at the door wasn't a threat. Opening it, she found a teenage girl standing there, shifting nervously. She was no older than 16, with curly hair tied back in a ponytail and wary eyes that flickered between Aisha and Shadow. "Can I help you?" Aisha asked. The girl hesitated before speaking. People said. She swallowed. "You're the lady who stood up to those guys in the park, right?" Aisha studied her. "Depends on who's asking." The girl exhaled sharply. "My name's Kiara. They've been bothering me too." Aisha frowned. "They came after you?" Kiara nodded. "Not just me. Other girls too. They hang around near the school, calling us names, cornering us when no one's looking. My friend reported them once, but nothing happened. And after what you did..." She glanced at Shadow. "I thought maybe you could help." Aisha's fingers tapped against the doorframe. She had hoped the men had learned their lesson, but predators rarely changed overnight. "You tell your parents?" she asked. Kiara scoffed. "They just say to avoid them. But that's not a solution. I'm tired of being scared." Aisha studied the fire in the girl's eyes. Fear had brought her here, but courage had made her knock. "Come inside," Aisha said. "Let's talk." As Kiara stepped in, Shadow moved closer, sniffing the air before giving an approving wag of his tail. Aisha smiled. "Looks like he trusts you. That's a good sign." Kiara smiled back just a little. The fight wasn't over. Maybe it never would be. But Aisha had never been one to back down. And now, it seemed, she wasn't the only one willing to stand her ground. She looked at Kiara, the next generation. Maybe it was time to teach more than just the cowards a lesson. Maybe it was time to teach others how to fight back. She reached down, scratching Shadow's ears. "You up for another job, old boy?" Shadow thumped his tail against the floor, his answer clear. Aisha nodded, turning back to Kiara. "Let's get to work." The next few days, Aisha found herself busy in ways she hadn't been in years. Kiara wasn't the only one. Word spread quickly, and soon a small group of young girls started showing up at her house. Some had been harassed by the same men in the park. Others had their own stories of intimidation. They were tired of running. Tired of being afraid. Aisha saw herself in them. A younger version, full of fire but without direction. And so, she decided to give them what no one had given her when she was their age. A way to fight back. She started with awareness. "The first thing they count on," she told the girls one afternoon, "is fear. They want you to shrink, to second-guess yourself. That's how they win before they even lift a hand." She taught them how to walk with confidence, how to keep their heads up instead of looking down. She showed them how to be aware of their surroundings, identifying exits, watching for warning signs, trusting their instincts. Then she moved to self-defense. Aisha had never been a fighter in the traditional sense, but life had forced her to learn a few things. She taught them simple, effective moves, how to break a grip, how to use their elbows, how to make themselves a harder target. Nothing fancy, just enough to buy time and escape. And of course there was Shadow. The girls adored him. He became their silent protector, his presence alone making them feel safer. Aisha used him to teach them about body language, not just his, but their own. "The way you stand, the way you move, it all sends a message," she explained. "Predators look for easy prey. Don't be easy." Kiara was the quickest learner. She took every lesson seriously, practicing until it became second nature. She walked differently now, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. "You're a natural," Aisha told her one evening. Kiara grinned. "I just had a good teacher." Aisha smiled, but she knew the real test was coming. And it came sooner than expected. One evening, Kiara and two of the other girls, Maya and Tasha, were walking home from the library when they saw them. The same three men loitering near the bus stop, laughing among themselves. Kiara felt Maya tense beside her. Let's take the long way," she whispered. Kiara shook her head. No, we walked straight through." Maya's eyes widened. Are you crazy?" We show them we're not afraid, Kiara said firmly. Tasha hesitated, then nodded. She's right. They kept walking. The men noticed them immediately. Look who it is, the tall one sneered. Little girls out past bedtime? The others chuckled. One of them stepped forward, blocking their path. Didn't we tell you to stay away? Kiara met his gaze, her heart pounding but her face calm. No, you told us to be afraid. We're not. The man's smirk faltered. You got a mouth on you, girl? He reached out, maybe to shove her, maybe to grab her. Kiara didn't wait to find out. She moved fast, just like Aisha had taught her. She twisted, grabbing his wrist and yanking it downward while stepping back, breaking his balance. He stumbled, caught off guard. Tasha and Maya reacted too, moving out of reach just as they practiced. The man swore, straightening. You little. A sharp, familiar growl cut through the air. They turned, and there was shadow. Aisha stood a few feet away, his leash loose in her grip. But Shadow wasn't waiting for permission. He stepped forward, ears pinned back, teeth bared, a low rumbling warning in his chest. The men froze. Aisha's voice was calm but firm. I think very carefully about your next move. Silence. Then slowly the men backed away. You crazy old hag, one muttered, but there was no fight in his voice. Only fear. They turned and left, disappearing into the night. Aisha exhaled, then looked at Kiara. You handled that well. Kiara grinned, breathless but steady. I had a good teacher. Aisha chuckled, then looked at the other girls. You all did good. But this isn't over. They'll remember this, and so will you. But the next time they try, they'll know you're not easy targets anymore. Kiara looked down at Shadow, who wagged his tail once before resuming his usual calm stance. She reached out and scratched behind his ear. Good boy, she whispered. Shadow only leaned into her touch, the same silent guardian he had always been. And from that day on, none of those girls ever walked in fear again.